Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow's Friday, Parashat Bo, and we cannot do this week's portion without relating it to current events. And I'll open up by a question. If you had like a plan, and you knew the one side for sure, the other side would not at all, you want to make a deal, and you know the other side is not going to accept the deal, so you make an offer that supposedly that they can't refuse, but knowing at the end that they're going to refuse it. So it's sort of, you don't really mean what you say, and you're putting up a front, you're putting on a show. Are you allowed to do something like that according to Jewish law? Now, why am I, you obviously probably figured out why I'm presenting this as a question, because wow, people dancing in the streets, a lot of people on the right wing, the right side, have been dancing so happy. Look what happened, look what President Donald Trump has done, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, wow. They're brilliant people, and they gave an offer like they can't refuse, and they're going to refuse it anyway, the Arabs. So at the end, it's going to be all good for Israel. So that's the question: are you allowed to do something like that, knowing the other side is totally really don't mean what you say? So you're sort of putting on a show, and just for a purpose of achieving your goals. So that's is an expression in Hebrew, and I'm going to deal with this question. First of all, a Jewish law question. Is someone who follows Torah allowed to do something like that? Right? Is it part of our religion to behave that way? And I want to show you from this week's portion, it's unbelievable how things are always connected. And we're going to see from our portion, this question comes up in commentaries. We're going to talk about this very question comes up in this week's portion. So let's open up first of all. By the way, when we finish this whole thing, then I'll give my opinion on the plan of the century. I'd like to give a few words. As a resident of Itamar, living here in the area where they want to annex, but we're going to be like some kind of isolated community according to the plan, I would like to say a few words, if you allow me, about that as well. But first, let's get to the verse in Proverbs. I want to open up with a verse in Proverbs, and it says, "Fat emet tikon la'ad." When someone speaks truth, it is something that is eternal, goes on forever. Ve'ad al-gi'ah l'shon shaker. But when someone says a lie, it's only temporary. It doesn't go far. So that temporary could be, in historical framework, could be for many years, but it's still temporary. It's something that will not eventually persist. Eventually it will collapse, a lie. So we know that truth is the name of the game, and we are always, as people of faith, believing in God, we know the importance of speaking the truth, and honesty is such an important thing. So with that introduction, I'd like to bring down a law. There's a law brought down in the laws of Deot. The laws of Deot by Maimonides talk about laws that, again, how we relate to one another. And Maimonides brings down like this, and I will quote him. He says a person is not allowed to speak, very, very, like, I would say, smooth talking. When you try to smooth talk somebody, in other words, you don't mean what you say. And in other words, when you put forth from your mouth, you have to believe what you say. So you have to be honest about that. He brings different examples. He brings example even those that are not of the members of your own faith. In other words, to the non-Jewish world, you can't be deceitful. You must tell the truth, and you must be honest with them. And this concept is called Gnevat Hadat, when you steal someone's knowledge. And it brings an example when you are doing business with somebody, you want to be very careful to let the person know exactly, what you are doing business with and what the plan is, and not to try to deceive him in any way and try to mislead the person in any way. And he brings different examples. One of the examples he brings down is he's not supposed to invite a guest over to your house, knowing that he's going to refuse. Like, for example, you invite one of your friends, I want you to come over to me Saturday night and have a great Melava Malka with me. But you know that he's invited to a wedding. Give an example. Or he has some kind of other event. So you saw that and you knew that, but you invited him anyway, knowing that, wow, now you gained something by that, by making it seem like you wanted to have him. You really didn't want to have that person. So that's called Gnevat Hadat. The Rambam brings other examples. Let's say you're a wine seller and you have very, very, you have wine, barrels of wine, and you bring some kind of friend, an acquaintance, and you open up the barrel, this expensive barrel of wine. Wow, I did that in your honor. But in reality, you're going to have, in about an hour from now, 20 people that are coming to buy that wine, so you really didn't open it for your friend, you opened it for the purposes of selling it, but it made it seem like this person was being honored. So we call this, the Rambam says, you must speak truth and a pure heart and stay away from these kind of things. And that's a prohibition from the Torah. We are not allowed to behave in this terrible way by being dishonest to people. And it doesn't make a difference who we are being dishonest to. People of our own faith, as we mentioned, anybody, any Gentile, we have to be very careful in honesty. It's a very, very important thing. So with that said and done, now comes the boom. And you can figure out where we're going to. But I'd like to bring down, in this week's portion, I'm going to read the verse. If we look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 36. And God says, and this comes from the, if you recall, this week's portion, we're moving forward and getting out of Egypt, and the plagues are coming to an end. And it's brought down that God placed within the hearts of the Egyptians after they got hit with all the 10 plagues. And it says, Vayishalum, they lent the people of Israel all kinds of vessels. And it says the Jewish people, they just literally took out, by Natzlut Mitzrayim, so they took out all those vessels from Egypt, right? They emptied them out. Now, if you look at this verse, it seems a little bit strange. It doesn't say they gave the vessels to Israel, but it says they lent them to Israel. Now, why do they say they lent them to Israel for? Right? That's a good question. Why does it say they gave them? I mean, Israel wasn't planning on coming back. But this makes a lot more sense if we go back to Exodus chapter 3. And what does it say in Exodus chapter 3? So I'll remind you about that. It talks about the vision of of what's it called, the sneh, the burning bush. And God tells Moshe Rabbeinu in chapter 3, verse number 16 through 20, and it says, go and gather up Israel. And God says, and you tell them, I am the God of your fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'm remembering what the Egyptians have done to you. And then he goes on to say, and I'm going to bring you into the land of Israel, the land of the Canaanites, the Hivites. God's going to give us that land. And then it goes on into into verse 18, saying that they will listen to your voice, and you'll go, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Paro, and you will tell him that God has come to us, and we want to go for 3 days in the desert to offer sacrifices to God. So we see here, in these 3 verses, we see 2 interesting points. In verse number 17, God tells Israel that I'm going to give you the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites. There are 7 nations living in the land. I'm going to give you that land. So wait a second. I have to push out other nations on your behalf. Is that something that's also a proper actual behavior? There are nations living in that land, or I'm promising now to give it to you, the people of Israel. So that's question number 1. That is not, again, that's not stealing someone's knowledge, but you can say outright taking it away from someone else and taking it over. So that's a moral question, right there, in a way. And in verse number 18, it goes on to say that God is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses, to tell Paro that in 3 days, let us go out, we just want to go for 3 days, and we want to offer sacrifices to God. Now, wait a second, this is 100% what I spoke about it before in the opening, that this is totally misleading, because we know that the plan was to leave Egypt totally and then come to Israel. We weren't planning on coming back after 3 days, so why did God tell Moshe Rabbeinu to tell the king of Paro, tell him 3 days? That's outright being deceitful, not being honest, just telling the truth. Well, God has a problem of telling the truth to Paro. He can rescue us in any way. So something very interesting that they mentioned those words. Now this connects what I opened up with about lending the items to Israel, because the Egyptians thought that Israel was going on a temporary journey and they're going to return. So therefore they lent the items to Israel instead of giving them to them, because they thought Israel was coming back. So their intentions were lending them. Now if we look over here, this seems very, very clearly 100% misleading, Genevat dat, actually lying. It's exactly what I mentioned before, we're not allowed to do. So we see here these 2 ethical questions. Number 1, giving a land of people that supposedly are living there, right? They have that, they're living in the land now. And number two, being deceitful and saying that we're coming back and then taking these items and running out of Egypt with these items of the Egyptians as they're lending them to us at the end of the day, never coming back. So why this kind of behavior seems improper? And the commentary is right away because there are no discounts. When it comes to Torah, the rabbis are always questioning everything and clarifying everything, and the question comes up right away: how could this kind of behavior take place? In the Or Chaim HaKadosh, many commentaries ask this question. The Ibn Ezra asked the question. Other Rishonim asked the question. And one answer is given, a very simple answer, is that, wait a second, we are in battle, buddy. Right now, God is teaching us a lesson for generations. I'll put it in my words, right? And the fact is that certain times in history, God is telling us, we can't be so naive and do things right up front if we're dealing with people that want to destroy us and want to kill us. We have to sometimes work with ways that seem on the outside deceitful, but that's when it comes to battle and war and life-threatening situations, of course you're allowed to do everything you can to survive in that situation. And you can't compare it to when we're living at peace with one another, how we have to behave to people, not being deceitful. But when people they have a plan to uproot us from our land or here in the case of course, Egypt, they want to enslave us, they wanted to murder us, and Israel now wanted to get out for the sake of freedom. So then that's battle for sure. We're allowed to go ahead and behave in this kind of way. There's nothing wrong with making the Egyptians feel that it's going to only be 3 days. In this way, we could have a plan of escape. If you would have said too long, they would have never let us leave. It would have been different. But the idea was to give them that impression as part of a ploy to get away and then make the move. So it was part of a tactical warfare, using tactics in warfare, which is 100% legitimate. And God was telling Israel, I know my people, you're such an honest people, and I'll bring down a midrash to support this. The midrash says, why are the Egyptians so readily willing to give up all their possessions to lend them to Israel? Wouldn't they think that they're going to go off with it? And the reason no is because they saw during the days of darkness, when the Egyptians couldn't see anything, and everywhere a Jew would go, he would have light. They could have literally, what happens when in New York City when there's a blackout? Nothing's left in the stores anymore. Well, that's what the Egyptians were worried about, but they saw that the Jews, the slaves, they didn't take, if nothing was taken. And they realized that dealing with an honest group of people, and therefore they were willing to come and come along and lend them items in order to, thinking that they could get them back. In reality, I want to bring down an interesting Talmudic passage in regards to this very thing, because it's not such a one-sided thing. It says in the Gemara, in the Talmud, in the tractate of Brachot, and now we know those who are learning the Daf Yomi, the one page of Talmud a day. This was a couple of weeks ago. We're in this tractate, so you probably remember it. Those who are learning it, and it says like this: Vayashilum, right? And the Egyptians lent Israel all these items. So Amar Rabbi Ami melamed sheishilum bal kocham. So one of the rabbis say, this teaches us that they did it without the other side's agreement on it, that they forcibly lent them items. Now, why? Why does the Gemara of Ami come to the conclusion that lending the items to Israel, the spoils, to take with them, was done by force? And the answer is because it says vayashilum in Hebrew. That's the hifil form. In Hebrew, we can tell by the grammatical form, by the different kind of verb. Now, if they borrowed it, would have used a different word. If it was a passive kind of borrowing, it would have said v'sha'alu, and they asked for it, they borrowed it. But it says that hishilum is a hifil form, that they actually forced it upon them. Now, there are two opinions. One, it was forced on Israel, and the other opinion, the Egyptians were forced to lend them the items. And those are the two sides. So on one hand, we see a side that says Israel didn't want to borrow anything, right? Israel, now they didn't want to take anything from the Egyptians. They said, let me get out of here. I want freedom. That's all I want is freedom. I want to leave Egypt. And so the Egyptians had to forcibly come over to them and say, take these items. And the other opinion says, no, Israel said, you lend me this right now. You better lend me this item. So there was an opinion that it was Israel that demanded them to lend the items to them. Now, Another place in the Talmud in Sanhedrin talks about an interesting discourse where one of the rabbis has a meeting with an Egyptian later on. This talks at the end of the Second Temple period, and having a debate. This was a time of Alexander the Great, and it was a debate going on. And what was the debate? The Egyptian claim was, you left, they brought down this verse, you left Egypt with all our items that you borrowed them, you never gave back to us. So now we want it back. So person who made himself seem simple, but he was a very, very great rabbi. In reality, sometimes you have to behave with modesty, all right? But in reality, obviously, this person was very, very great. His name was Gavia ben Psisa, and he told the rabbis, you know something? Let me deal with this debate. Let me answer the questions. He comes along, and what does he answer? He says, well, all the hundreds of years that the people of Israel were enslaved, we never got paid for what we did. So you come along and claim you want to, want us to give you back what we borrowed. That's our payment for being slaves. That was the answer to that question, which was brought down in the Talmud. This debate took place at the end of the Second Temple, and debates continued like this took place even through the Middle Ages. We know all kinds of debates, similar debates took place in always coming along with Israel with claims. And anyway, getting back to our inyan, our thing, we see from over here is that there was, even amongst Israel, the Talmud is trying to bring two sides. There are those who could say, on one hand, Israel didn't want to even forcibly borrow because they don't want to behave this way. And obviously the reason that Israel didn't want to behave this way is because although it was coming to them, the Talmud says they didn't want to carry all that burden, but I think in another deep way we can say there was also a burden, the burden of saying we did something that wasn't 100% honest. Because they knew it wasn't borrowing, we knew we're not going to come back. So there was a whole camp of Israel saying, we can't even in a situation like this, we don't want to say something that's not truthful. But on the other hand, the opinion explains that the Egyptians forced it, right? I'm sorry. The other opinion says that Israel took it forcibly, right? So why would the Jewish people of Israel, who have to live a life of honesty, take it forcibly? That would explain those who feel that in cases of war, we have to behave, sometimes like the enemy does, and do things that are misleading. And they're not going to get it back. And that's really, we see in the beginning when God telling Moses, at the end of the day, sometimes in history you can have to behave that way. And we see this, of course, with the firstborn right. Jacob takes the birthright of Esau. And we know, of course, that was for the benefit of mankind. So certain times you have to play against the basic rules of honesty when we are very, very important things are at stake. Now, if we take this whole thing that I just explained to you all and compare it to the reaction of Netanyahu and Bush, I'm sorry, and Donald Trump, so when they're coming along and they're saying, something, they're making this offer to the Arabs of this whole, an offer of 70% of Judea and Samaria, status quo on Temple Mount, $50 billion, all kinds of other things. So this is like an offer of the century, they can't refuse it. But a lot of the right wing was dancing and saying, why they made this offer? Well, because they know they're not going to accept it. The Arab won't accept anything less than Tel Aviv, less than pushing Israel into the sea. So let's be smart. They're not going to accept the offer. And then we'll have now a good way of annexing at least 30% of the territory now. And later on, we'll continue the process in the future. So at least we'll have facts on the ground that way. And that was like the side of where God was saying, sometimes you have to behave, a little bit, mislead the other side to try to bargain and to try to save what you can in certain situations, in emergency situations. You're at battle, so we can try to save right now at this point. We can do this in order to save, at this point, 150 settlements and the Jordan Valley, annex that now. We're in battle. Let's just go for that now. So you could say we see this as a justification, at least of that kind of behavior within the portion on one side. But now I'm talking from another angle. Another angle totally is, can we compare? Now, what I'm saying, can we compare? My feelings as someone who lives here in Judea, Samaria, and living here since 1985, moved to Israel, coming back, calling back to the land of Israel was an everlasting right that God gave. The land of the Hivites, the Canaanites, God said, no, the land is given to this was already destined in prehistory to be given to Israel. And that's why we have a right to be here, because God said this is already designed in the beginning for you. The other nations came in afterwards. When the land was divided up way back in history to the sons of Noah, and we come from the Shem. We stem from this area. It was already destined for the people of Israel, for the people, the apple of God's eye was destined way back then. And God is saying I'm giving you this land. This is your land forever, our land. And this was, of course, what every Jewish person who lives abroad and is called back knows that we're coming back. What's calling us back is our heart, our homeland here, this area right here, Judea and Samaria. And we know, and these borders that were outlined by God, there's no room for another state. So even though the plan, and they mean well and all that, but I still think that the dangers of announcing 70% of the land will be given as an Arab state. I'm not going to use the word Palestine because it doesn't exist obviously in my lexicon. It shouldn't exist in any lexicon because it's just a lie, a made-up lie. We can't possibly fathom of turning our homeland and giving it away to foreigners. It was never destined. It's going against the Torah. It's going against God. So endorsing a plan like this that mentions something like that, or says the Temple Mount, the status quo be maintained, what about our temple has to be rebuilt there? So we're sort of feeding again, we're feeding false information and false hope into the hearts of, let's say, forget about these Arabs that are here now and that are going to refuse anyway the plan. But for the world, looking at this and saying, some of these are consensus, even Israel, even Netanyahu, he's a prime minister, right? So he's for a plan that calls for self-determination for these Arab people here. And that is something that we have to stand up with our two strong legs and say, no, we can never, ever, and whatsoever, and very careful, because if they say, okay, it's not going, this whole thing falls apart because the Arabs are not going to accept it, but they can say, okay, you agreed, maybe in the future time, someone's going to come along and say, let's have peace now. You agreed to give 70% of your land away. So we have to start from that point. And it's very, very dangerous. So therefore, we have to be careful. On one hand, yes, we have to immediately annex what we can, annex everything. But if they want to start with 30%, we'll be happy to annex 30%. So that's the good side, right? But we have to be very, very careful not to fall in and give up on our 70%, which is ours, which God gave us, the land of Israel, the blessing from the east to west and beyond. The land of Israel, the borders are outlined in the Bible. We all know the biblical boundaries. And we have to pray and know that God, every word of the prophets and every word that God told us is a word that will become true. So we will build our third temple, as the prophets talk about, and we will live in our full boundaries and our full borders. And the world will turn around. So this is a process. We have to say that is we have to stand strong for. And okay, if this plan ends up working out behind the scenes, but to make a show, whatever it was, but no one's buying the show anyway. Everyone's very clear. We all know the Arabs are not going to agree to anything, but I think it's a bad taste in my mouth. It leaves a very bad taste because we have to say the truth that Israel will never, never settle for a Palestinian so-called state. There's only room for one state here, the state of Israel, and the biblical boundaries that God outlined in the Bible to us. And we have to, all our friends and all our supporters must stand up and say this. And everyone has to hear this. God forbid, people should get used to the term a Palestinian state here. And that is a dangerous thing. And that we have to protest against. So that's really the point I want to make here. Living on Etam, I don't want to have to use a passport to get to Jerusalem, right? Or they're going to build some kind of tunnel called Trump Netanyahu Tunnel. I don't want that either. I want to walk, I want to drive, I want to go on my camel and freely walk in my land in freedom. And that's what it really should be, because we have, again, so the question is, okay, what's going to be with these Arabs, the Palestinian so-called, right? There's no Palestine, there's no Palestinians. There are Arab people living here, and if they want to live in peace with Israel, there's nothing wrong with that. That's called a Ger Toshav. If they really truly want peace with us, we have no problem. But we can't turn this phony concept as an Arab state. It doesn't exist. This is Israel, the state of Israel. Anyway, I'm sure we will have to continue this in the future. It's a very hot topic. But anyway, just look into the portion, and we see, one more mention about the portion, we see how God's hardening the heart all the time of Paro. And that's always our blessing, is that God hardens the hearts of the Arabs not to agree on any of these plans, because if they agreed to these plans, by now we'd be really in about 0% of Judea and Samaria. So because of hardening the paro of today, which is Abbas, we are, thank God, standing strong, holding on to our land, and we need you to continue to stand with us. Shabbat Shalom, B'Sarot Tovot, Yeshuot V'Nechamot.